that longing look, the child in your eyes, the strength it took to grow to be wise, such tenderness, see through any disguise. Take me in, take me in.
Welcome to Shelter and Solidarity, a deep dive with artists and activists during this COVID pandemic. I'm your host, Joe Ramsey, live streaming, Zooming, and broadcasting on YouTube with you here from Dorchester, Massachusetts, on the south side of Boston, now in our 5th month of sheltering in place. This is our 17th episode of Shelter and Solidarity, and we are diving into a very timely topic: the left and the election, looking at the state of democracy in the United States of America in the year 2020, looking towards the November election, question mark. We're going to be joined today by two wonderful guests, one as our featured guest and one as a respondent that will be joining us later in the broadcast. And we will be, as always, opening up the conversation to you, our live participants, about an hour in as we go about 90 minutes with these shows. Our first guest will be Victor Wallis. Victor Wallis is with us from Somerville, Massachusetts, I believe today. Victor is the author of 3 books: Democracy Denied, 5 lectures on US politics, Red Green Revolution, the politics and technology of eco-socialism, as well as his most recent book entitled Socialist Practice, History and Theories. Victor is someone I've worked with for a long time. He has been the longtime managing editor until very recently of the journal Socialism and Democracy, one of the great sponsors of this program. About 20 minutes into the program, we will be joined by Medea Benjamin, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. She is the co-founder and organizer with Code Pink, an author of around a dozen or more books, a long, consistent critic and activist in the United States political scene, particularly, but not only, on issues related to US foreign policy. And we will be having her join us as a respondent and as a speaker in her own right after we get into a bit of a deep dive with Victor. So first, I just want to welcome Victor, and I do want to welcome Medea before we turn to Victor first. Victor, thank you for being here.
Thank you, Joe. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to see you, comrade. Medea, it's great really to have you joining us on the show for the first time. We really appreciate you being here. Great to have you.
Thank you so much. Look forward to the discussion.
Terrific. All right. So let's dive in. Victor, in your book, Democracy Denied, which I cannot recommend enough for both the novice and the scholar, veteran activist, you give a concise but comprehensive view of the many ways that American democracy has never been all that democratic when it really comes to its practice. From the founding of the society all the way up to the present. What do you see as the most important ways that democracy in the United States has in fact been denied? And I welcome you here as we start the show and we do try to cultivate a deep dive. I encourage you to maybe flesh out the picture historically, and then we will move more to the contemporary moment and today. But Victor, what would you say? What are the ways that democracy in the United States has historically been denied?
Well, that's a big question, but of course, the basic power system is the system of capitalism, which is itself an undemocratic system. And the thing about the United States is that unlike other advanced capitalist countries, its working class has had less of an effective political presence. And it's in the other countries, the political presence of the working class has enabled a greater degree of democracy, which has been lacking in the United States. And so that there's a whole history of that. I mean, it's pretty well known, at least to anyone, let's say, who has read, for example, Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, that the United States was never intended to be a democracy. The founding fathers did not like democracy. They said as much in so many words in the famous Federalist Paper number 10. They were afraid of, and this is almost their own words, of a majority feeling its power and able to act in unison against the property holders. So one way or another of blocking that possibility has been in effect all along. So you add to this a number of other things. Obviously, the slave economy and the divisions in the working class that resulted from the racial division that was created on the basis of slavery, but also the whole institutional setup. In a way, I mean, speaking of the presidential election, we don't have a national election. We have 51 separate elections in 50 states in the District of Columbia. And this shapes strategy. And for many years, this didn't attract that much notice, but more recently, and especially in the last election, it's come absolutely to the fore, because you have the phenomenon, which I don't know of in any other country, where a candidate who wins the most votes doesn't get the victory. So you have this tremendous confusion in a way. And added to that is, of course, another fairly well-known fact, although I don't think it's emphasized enough, certainly not in the media, that in this country, there's no constitutional guarantee of the right to vote. And this seems to have been carefully planned, because every time there was a constitutional amendment to give the vote to greater sectors of the population, the amendment was always put in negative terms. Nobody shall be denied the right to vote on the grounds of whatever. But that still leaves open the possibility of denying people the right to vote on some other pretext. And most recently, it's been voter ID laws, or voter suppression of one form or another, shutting down polling places. Now with Trump, a campaign against mail ballots. All this has been, these most recent efforts of voter suppression have been very well described by the journalist Greg Palast. And I urge you to read his book, How Trump Stole 2020. It builds on his earlier book, The Best Democracy Money Can Buy. So you have all these institutional obstacles to the franchise. And of course, the obstacles affect above all the poorest sectors of the population, which in this country, because of the legacy of slavery, have been disproportionately African American, but to which you can also add the Latino and Native American sectors of the population among these. And the techniques that have been used to disenfranchise them in every possible way are mind-boggling. One other aspect of the institutions that deserves mentioning, the very fact that it's a multiple election in all these separate states means that each state administers the vote, including the vote for national office. And as it happens, and this is typical, I don't know of any state in which it's not the case, the administrators of the election in that state are the party in power in that state. And so you have obviously a conflict of interest, and this is fundamental. And this played, of course, a huge part in determining the outcome in 2016. Palast describes this very carefully and in great detail. So in any case, I want to say in general, though, that the major advances in progressive legislation in this country have all come as the result of social movements. So elections are something that we have to deal with in part and largely as a defensive posture. As actually it was Suren in a recent conversation said, it's a process of choosing our enemies, insofar as it's a choice between the Democrats and the Republicans. I do feel that it's important to have third-party presence, even though the institutions are stacked in such a way as to make it disadvantageous, difficult for a third party to enter in, because there's no phenomenon of ranked choice or instant runoff voting. But however, the fact that we have these 51 separate elections means that in some states where the contest between the two parties is skewed heavily towards one or the other, that leaves space for the entry of, I would say, from our point of view, the Green Party to have an important presence. And I would argue that it's important to have both a positive program that you can identify with, which I think the Green Party represents, but at the same time, not to forget the defensive consideration that we have to keep in mind about the difference between a reinstallation of Trump and a switch to the Democrats. So just as far as that goes, I would say that Biden is a lamentable candidate. However, the fact that Trump has created such a movement of white nationalism, white supremacy, justifying all this, requires that he be repudiated at the national level. And so that's, I think, an important underlying consideration as we go forward. So I've mentioned a number of considerations, but we can pick up and go further on any of them. But I think that's a kind of a brief view of the overall picture.
Yeah, no, thank you. You cover so much there, Victor. And I would like to dwell with the institutional a little bit longer before we dive into it. I'm sure many people are itching to talk about, the 2020 election and Trump's tweet, which I think we saw in our pre slides to start the show. His test balloon as to postponing the election. We'll come to that in a moment. But Victor, I want to just ask another question that comes out of reading your book, which I do, again, highly recommend. I plan to assign it to many of my students this fall, actually, as a primer. I mean, you talk about some of the institutions, even that right down to the present, right, that continue to disenfranchise people, not only at the polls or through closing polling places or not counting votes, but just but making it, illegal for certain people to vote at all, right? I mean, obviously, one of the most obvious examples would be the mass incarceration system, which you have written about extensively, and in fact are very active in crossing those walls through your correspondence with so many politically active prisoners. I wonder if could you say a little more about the, I guess two questions. What the ongoing institutional basis, the kind of background forces or institutional forces that limit and make the electorate in this country not the same thing as the people who actually live here. And then on the basis of that, maybe engage in a little bit of a utopian thought experiment, which again, you do this in your book a little bit. What if we actually had a system where everyone was able to vote, and literally everyone who lives here was able to vote? What would, in your view, this is again a thought experiment, how would American politics, look different, you think? Or what would be the implications of what was considered, realistic, the left, right, and center of American politics, if we in fact did have a system where everyone could in fact vote, not only including many of the people that are just systematically locked out, as well as people who just are not able to vote for other circumstances? That's kind of a two-part question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
I think it's good to answer the second question first, because obviously, if everyone voted, we would have a more progressive outcome. I think that's clear. That's recognized, of course, even by Trump and all his supporters. They recognize that if everyone voted, the Republicans would never get in again. They feel that the demographic pressure also of the country becoming more and more populated by people who are not of European descent, and they see that as an existential threat to themselves. They're using any defense, whatever, to keep them out. And so the limitation of the voting has always been directed against those who would have the greatest interest in structural change, which means against those who are most disadvantaged by the present system. Now, the successive ways in which this limitation has been carried out, that's a whole history. And of course, we know about slavery and then the fact that after the Civil War, when slavery was formally ended, except for convicts, the southern states imposed a system of segregation, which effectively disenfranchised almost all of the Black population. But then, when the Civil Rights Movement came and the Voting Rights Act came in 1965 and outlawed those restrictions that had been imposed in the southern states, there was a need from that perspective, from the perspective that had supported that system, to find a new basis for achieving the same ends. And this is where, as you suggest, the mass incarceration comes in, the disenfranchisement of the Black population, disenfranchised former felons, and so on. And and this was partly, with the drug war, the longer prison sentences, the prison population quintupling over a 30-year period, and then with people who had served in prison often being unable to vote, or at least fearing that they might be. But then in addition to those direct things, the new laws that were passed to require certain types of ID, done in a way that really a targeted kind of way. It had nothing to do with the supposed claims of preventing fraud, because, for example, in the state of Wisconsin, they wouldn't accept state-issued photo ID that was for students. They wouldn't accept that. So it's a totally arbitrary type of thing. So, and I might mention in that connection that young people, as well as Black people, people of color generally, are on the whole, especially at the present time, more likely to be progressive, but they're also more subject to pretexts that can be devised to exclude them, such as the fact that they've moved, changed their dress, and that type of thing. So there's all kinds of stratagems that are used, and they're constantly changing and adapting to the new situation. This is what Palast writes about so well. But certainly, there's been a succession of different methods used. And of course, now the most recent attempt to suppress the vote is the campaign to destroy the postal service, so as to make impossible the kind of mail ballot that would be needed to address the conditions for voting in this time of pandemic.
Yeah, I mean, I think you've brought us right back to the present again, Victor, which I appreciate. And I think as we do, return right to this moment in 2020, this trial balloon tweet from Trump this morning about perhaps postponing the election and casting, doubt on the possible results of a mail-in ballot election. I mean, let's dive into this now in terms of what we see as the stakes of this 2020 election, and what we make of Trump's tweets and other indications from Trump and other folks in the Republican Party, and as to trying to put off the election, delay it, or otherwise call into question the possible results of that election. Actually, Medea, I'd like to welcome you in to the conversation at this point to speak to anything that you've heard Victor say, but also perhaps to maybe start with the president this morning's tweet from Trump. What went through your head when you saw that tweet? And how generally do you see the kind of situation of this 2020 election?
Well, first I thought coup. I had been in Bolivia in November 2019 and was witness to the coup that happened there. And I thought, oh my gosh, what is this? He's announcing a coup before it happened. And then the more I thought about it and heard people talking about it, I realized that it was not so much that he was really going to postpone the election because he doesn't have the power to do that. It was that he wanted to call the election itself into question and lay the groundwork for not only his base to say, wait a minute, this isn't fair, we don't concede, and the other to have a long drawn out process, much longer and much more drawn out than 2000 when it went into the courts there. But I think we could see something significantly more complicated because that was just in one state, in the state of Florida. But imagine if his wing of the Republican Party, because I'm sure there would be some division as we're already seeing since his tweet came out, but his base and his followers trying to contest this in states all over the country, and the mayhem that would result in that. Would we be able to bring out our folks? Would his folks come out? Would they be armed? It just conjures up a very scary future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it almost points towards the possibility of insurrection, or the prospect, the specter of a kind of possible civil war, right? I mean, or at least so I mean, what do you think should be the popular left response in this moment? I mean, not to say we should be just chasing down every reactive to every Trump tweet. Of course, again, he some people I've seen speculating online that this tweet could be primarily to distract us from the bad economic news from this quarter that has come in, right? So there's always with Trump this like doubleness. Something could be a horrible trial balloon that really is dangerous, and yet at the same time could be distracting from something that's actually even more likely to actually occur. So, I mean, I'd like to hear, what do you think should be of the progressive or left response to this sort of coup floating And after I hear your response, Medea, I'd like to maybe hear Victor's response on that too, and just to the morning's events and just the immediacy of this 2020, this threat of delegitimizing the election that we're facing right now. Yeah, Medea.
I think, as Victor points out in his books, change happens through social movements, and we can't leave it to political parties. And our opposition to Trump's manipulation of the elections, voter suppression, the lies he tells about fraud connecting to mail-in voting, all of this has to come from a place of not, I support the Democratic Party and want to see Biden in the White House. It's got to come from a place of, I want to have the United States one day have free and fair elections. And we're working towards that goal. And as we work towards that goal, we mobilize. So we haven't had a chance yet to talk about what Victor talks about in the books of the importance of social movements in general. But I think we need to discuss that when we talk about how we should be planning for November, because I think there's two roads to pass. One is already, I see very closely allied Democratic Party organizations putting out alarm bells saying, uh-oh, look what Trump said. Most of them say, so give us money. But some of them saying, all right, we've got to start organizing. And then I know that there are groups that are not connected to the Democratic Party who have already been saying and already been online organizing for what can we do if there is no election, if there's a stolen election, if Trump won't concede the election. So my advice is we don't go with the Democratic Party operatives who would manipulate us as this goes forward, but we go with the non-partisan groups, and there's many of them that are organizing. And I think in a way it's very exciting to see the response to the one tweet today and how many groups have pounced on it to say, okay, now let's ramp up the organizing we've already been talking about in the last month or two.
That's great. I'd love to hear more about that organizing and how that might actually look on the ground. But Victor, let's go to you first to just hear your thoughts on Trump's tweet this morning and more generally these issues that Medea has been bringing us into.
Just briefly, I think the basic point is that Trump knows and the Republicans know that they stand to lose the election. And so they're doing everything possible to prevent that from happening. And all the scenarios that Medea mentions are possible. And I think that in response to that, it's important that that there be an appeal to what is really the base, those who vote for the Democrats without really endorsing their program, but the real base of the party, which is the working class, people of color, and so on. Because there's a whole debate within the Democratic Party, and really even a rupture within that party between those who really represent the party's base and those who instead think of winning over Republicans to their side. So we have to encourage those who really want to activate the base by pushing for the progressive programs that recognize the gravity of the situation that the society is in. Not only the COVID crisis, more generally the absence of a decent healthcare system, and then on a larger scale, the environmental crisis as a whole. I don't think there's enough of a sense of emergency in the population as a whole about the urgency of addressing the environmental crisis. And so the emphasis needs to be not just on the personnel, but on the issues. And if people can be persuaded of the urgency of this and can get involved on that basis, it'll motivate people to come out more, even incidentally in the elections, but more in a more long-term sense as part of the kinds of social movements that we're looking for and trying to build.
So, Joseph, can I ask a question of Victor?
Absolutely.
I wonder, Victor, with what you think is going to happen in the economy from now till November, and if there is not another bill that comes out that that compensates people for their lost income and we start seeing these massive evictions and really extreme situations of lots of people in this country, do you think that is the basis of more of an uprising before November that will not just be an anti-Trump uprising, but will be against the system?
I agree with that. I mean, I think it's a disaster. It's already a disaster, but becoming even more so, because with all the evictions, this has a ripple effect which goes back and can undermine the system as a whole, which is again more of the underlying reason why the Republicans fear the outcome of the election and doing everything possible to distort that outcome. It's a really severe situation. We are in a depression, and it's only getting worse, and they're making it worse as we speak. And I would recommend to listeners to follow Richard Wolff's program, Economic Update. He has an excellent coverage of this whole issue and of the tremendous scale that has been reached by the debt. And this can't go on. You're just creating money out of nothing. It can go on for a certain time, and then the bubble will burst eventually. And whether it'll happen before the election, I can't tell. I don't think anyone knows that. But there's a certain fear on the part of those in office that they're being discredited all the time. And that's why they have to take these desperate measures to suppress popular participation.
Yeah, I mean, one thing I'm hearing from both of you is that you clearly kind of reject, right, a kind of binary opposition, like an either-or approach to thinking about electoral politics versus social movement politics. You've both spoken about social movements as the primary agent of change, and yet you're both clearly not dismissive or disparaging of those who engage in electoral politics, even though you have clear criticisms which haven't been fully developed yet, but I'm sure I can imagine some of them in terms of the actually existing Democratic Party, and particularly Democratic Party leadership and Biden himself. So I guess I'd like to bring it back to Medea. Could you elaborate a little more on maybe whether you want to mention specific groups or the types of actions? What would it mean to build, the movement to defend democracy, to assure the results of the election, to make the election happen, that would not simply be succumbing to kind of just taking the line from the Democratic Party and just following Biden's, or just simply endorsing Biden? What are the different forms that either you think this kind of organizing could take, or that frankly it is already taking, and that we just need to kind of plug people into?
Well, first let me say that at the time of the 2000 election, I was very active in the Green Party. And when I saw how the election was being stolen by the Republicans, went down to Broward County in Florida and actually got into the county offices where they were doing the recount, and said that as a legitimate third party, the Green Party had the right to have people in there as part of the recount. But more important, we were going to communities around there, and Jesse Jackson was there at the time, and he was going into the Black churches, and he was getting people ready to rise up. And they wanted to rise up. They wanted to take to the streets. They wanted to surround the Broward County building. They wanted to, they talked about an ongoing protest. And the elements were there for that to happen, except the higher ups in the Democratic parties that came in and said, no way, no, 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 and squashed the whole thing. So in one way, I think that people spontaneously want to come out and protest when they feel their vote is being stolen. But that's something that would happen more after the election than before the election. So in some ways, I think afterwards, there is more possibility of, with some leadership behind it, but a lot of spontaneity. It's before the elections that we have to have more of a push. And I do see, like last night, there was a call that I unfortunately missed, but I heard it was great, of a group called Shut Down DC. And they're talking about, what to do in the case of if it looks more and more like these elections are either not going to happen or not going to be fair. There's groups that work like Extinction Rebellion, the more radical groups in the environmental movement, the more radical groups and the healthcare movement. All of these groups are talking. And then there's other people that are doing sort of role playing as you would do war games to kind of play out the scenarios that of what could happen. And so, I think Trump's tweet today has given tremendous impetus, and there will probably be many more of these groups now coming out to start creating affinity groups, which, if anybody doesn't know, they're smaller groups that are people who are friends with each other, 12, 15 people who can take very quick action, spontaneous action. That's one way of organizing, where people then have spokespeople from each of those affinity groups that are part of a spokespeople group. And it's much more decentralized way that is harder to infiltrate and harder to destroy. So I could see that kind of organizing happening. But I think today has really sunk into a lot of people that we are in an emergency situation, and we can't sit back and wait to see what happens and then rise up after the election.
One great thing about Trump is that he doesn't seem to keep a secret very well, right? So, I mean, I guess he, although you never know what he's throwing on the wall, how much of it will stick, but he certainly has given us a kind of forewarning. Victor, I know you've been really plugging this Greg Palast book for quite some time. I mean, since the book came out anyway, you read it, How Trump Stole 2020. I have not read it yet, but I'm a big fan of knowing the obstacles. And if you know the obstacles, then you're halfway to knowing what the practice would be to counter them. I mean, would you like to point our attention to anything that you've taken from Greg Palast's work, or more broadly from your own study of the disfranchisement strategies that are in play, in terms of what might be the inroads for organizing to counter those strategies? I assume, Palast wants his title to be incorrect, right? By illuminating the dangers that it could come true. Is there anything you'd like to point out to us in terms of the kind of strategies currently underway that might then point us towards the kind of organizing that needs to be done to counter?
Well, this is a difficult question, but I think that the emphasis on what he's describing, in a way, should be part of it should cut across all the other interests that we have, because what he describes in the book is so basic to people's elemental form of political participation that one would think everybody would be interested in terms of what exactly can be done organizationally. I mean, I'm thinking especially around universities. Like, well, again, it differs in each state and with the laws that you have in each state, but certainly among the students who are deprived of the vote by having to not being able to use their student ID to qualify them. There's a constituency right there for being organized. I think more generally, what we need is, again, always a great expansion of the alternative media, of the progressive, radical alternative media, to cast the light on this, and also really to call attention to the way that the Democratic establishment has not been, the Democratic Party establishment has not been interested in this issue. And actually, one of the chapters in Palast's recent book is not just about Trump, it is about how the Democrats also engage in this kind of trickery, as in California, where those who wanted to vote in the primary for Bernie Sanders found it difficult to do so because the ballots they were handed didn't give a slot for the presidential choice, and they had to use a special term to request the right kind of ballot in order to do this. So I mean, in other words, this is a general practice of the whole sort of political side of the ruling class to suppress any progressive tendency. And where to focus? The thing is, it cuts across every constituency. So I don't know. I don't have a single target constituency for this type of thing. But just to say that the radical media as a whole should draw more attention to this, to the total corruption of the process, because one of the things Palast shows he began, actually, it was already on his website before this book came out, saying that since 2016, 16 million people nationwide had their names scrubbed from the voter rolls without being notified. And the thing is, the pretext for that is that they had moved. And one of the tricks, again, is to send people a postcard. And if you don't hear back, then you scrub their names from the roll, but without ever notifying them. And the assumption is that this is to prevent some kind of fraud. And yet, as Pallas points out, nobody whose name has been taken off the rolls has ever been prosecuted for fraud. They just take their names off the rolls quietly. So I think just making a big noise about it, also because this shows in a larger sense the anti-democratic nature of capitalism as a whole, that the ruling class has to resort to these measures because it has lost all basis for support for its actual handling of society. It can't win elections fair and square, so it has to resort to these types of stratagem.
Can I jump in here too?
Yeah, please, anytime. Yeah.
Again, a question for Victor is, but we have seen with instances of the Squad and now more recently Jamal Bowman having defeated Elliott Abrams, a Democratic Party insider if there ever was. And so you see these points of light where progressive people that have connections to a base make their way in. And you also see that whether it was Bernie Sanders' campaign or AOC or many others right now, the ability to raise significant amounts of money from the grassroots and not needing the big money in politics. So how much do you see that, Victor, as an exception to the rule, or do you see that as a light that could grow stronger and stronger and really move the Democratic Party to the left?
Yeah, it's certainly an exception to the Democratic Party dominance. And I think as AOC herself mentioned at one point, she said in any other country, Joe Biden and I would not be in the same political party. I'm very encouraged by this development. And there's a peculiarity of the parties in this country, that they're not real parties, they're electoral committees. And what I see ultimately, my hope ultimately, is that all those who constitute the progressive wing of the Democratic Party will eventually see that they have to desert that shell. So there has to be a big space for them to develop as a kind of independent force, which I think they potentially are. Independent, that is to say, of the current corporate Democratic Party leadership. So I do see hope in that direction. And they also are among those who might call attention to the undemocratic nature of the system. But I think that the fact that you could have, on the one hand, Sanders making this impressive showing of running campaigns now twice based primarily on small contributions, but through one stratagem or another being prevented from getting the level of, let's say, recognition or success that he's earned by it. And this time around in the 2020, the process was a lot more complicated than it was in 2016. But with sort of all the establishment candidates sort of suddenly dropping out and leaving the way open for Biden, who had to face Sanders all along at the beginning, would probably have fared not nearly as well. I mean, he sort of won by forfeit. So yes, there is space in the sense that the Democratic Party is not a real party. It's a kind of umbrella within which progressive candidates can come to the fore. But we have to hope that ultimately the constituencies that they speak to will merge with those of, of the Green Party. They're largely the same people, even, I think, who support both.
So one thing I hear you saying, I think, Victor, and perhaps Medea as well, is that in some sense the Democratic Party, as it's historically existed, points of light to one side for the moment, doesn't really have what it takes to defend our democracy, right? And isn't actually that committed to deep democracy in general. And that thus opens up the possibility that those who are further to the left or more progressive then the Democratic Party as it now exists can in fact grow the forces that might in fact transcend the Democratic Party and create the basis for some kind of new politics, ironically by supporting the Democratic Party right now, or at least by uniting with the Democratic Party in its fight against Trump, right? That is to say, it's not either or, supporting some kind of left alternative or engaging with the Democrats, but there's the possibility of kind of doing both at once. It sounds like you both agree with that, although you might just, have a different view of like whether or not that change will actually ultimately find a home within the Democratic Party and pulling that party to the left, or it will have to burst that party asunder and create some new form. So I guess my question here is, what do you say to those on the left who maybe, including perhaps some people who were really turned on and inspired by the Bernie Sanders of the last two elections, and who maybe identify as socialists or transformative, more radical than the Democratic Party, and who now feel like they've been sold out so bad that Biden is such a horrible figure, both in terms of his record and his own, kind of the emergent stories about his personal life, that he's just someone that they can't support, and that they feel that they're somehow corrupted or diminished by supporting a Biden campaign, even if Trump is also awful. I mean, what is your view, to that kind of wing of the left movement, I think, which is significant, at least in numbers of younger people and others who just feel so fed up. They think the Democratic Party is the graveyard of social movements, and that frankly, the real change is going to come from the street anyway. So why should we even bother, putting significant percentage of our energy into voting when voting is going to mean ultimately voting for Biden? I'd love to hear both of your responses to that kind of outlook. We decided against having a debate on the show between, at least today, between like the voting and non-voting left. But I still would like to hear your thoughts, playing devil's advocate a bit, to that kind of left position, anti-Democratic Party, or perhaps anti-electoralism in general. I don't know who wants to take it first. Maybe Medea, can we go to you first and then Victor?
Sure. I think you said put a significant amount of your energy into the electoral politics. When Sanders was a candidate, I thought that was very important to do. I personally dropped a lot of things to start canvassing and went down to Florida, spending time there. And so many young people dropped what they were doing and put their lives on hold to go do that. Now that it's Biden, I certainly am not going to do that. And I know that the vast majority of people who are part of the Sanders campaign are not going to do that. But most of us will go and vote for Biden. So that's the difference between, pressing a button or sending in your absentee ballot and spending a lot of your time on electoral politics. And then in terms of what difference does it make? I work on foreign policy issues. And right now I see the Trump administration starving the people of Iran, the people of Venezuela, the people of Cuba, and I can go on and on, unfortunately. And there are millions of people in those countries waiting with bated breath to see if we can get Trump out of office and get Biden in, because they think there's a lot more possibilities with the Biden administration to perhaps go back to some of the very few but positive things that Obama did, such as the Iran nuclear deal, such as reestablishing relations with Cuba. And certainly we didn't have this very brutal, evil, inhumane level of economic sanctions that we have now under Trump. So for me, reflecting the needs of people that I work with on a regular basis that are in other countries and are the victims of this administration's foreign policy, which you could say is part of an overall Democratic Republican military industrial complex, you do have to say that there are differences that actually can make a difference in people's survival.
Okay, thank you, Medea. I want to come back to that in a moment, but let's hear Victor's thoughts on this. Victor, what's your response to that kind of?
Yeah, I agree entirely with what Medea has said. I mean, Biden is a terrible candidate. he's even criticized Trump for not being hostile enough towards China. Maybe that's pushed Trump to take a more hostile stance towards China. But the whole point is that we have to view that the Biden campaign not as something requiring a great deal of time and energy and support, but as requiring simply a recognition that the importance of getting Trump out of office is great, not because Biden would necessarily himself be that different, but because it would create more, slightly more openings marginally at certain points, but would above all, I think, represent a kind of repudiation at the popular level of the terrible racist white nationalist approach to everything that is embodied by Trump.
Yeah, I mean, these are profound points. I wanted to ask you, Medea, as someone who came onto my radar as a direct action activist, right, with Code Pink, right, involved particularly, as you mentioned, in calling attention to foreign policy injustices and the suffering of U.S. policies that are inflicting what they're inflicting abroad. I wanted to, how do you see? You've touched on it, but I wanted to speak more to your own experience as an activist, someone who's routinely, consistently disrupted, speeches and committee meetings of both leaders in both parties to call attention to, some of these foreign policy injustices. What is the outlook of a Trump administration versus a Biden administration look like to you in terms of how you evaluate the efficacy and the viability of direct action as a mode of pressuring policy change, on Capitol Hill? I'd like to hear your thoughts on how does the electoral scheme affect the activism?
So the activism is usually a coordinated inside-outside strategy. And that means you have to have people on the inside who you can relate to, talk to, put the pressure on. And it's been a frustrating 3.5 years with the Trump administration because when you work on foreign policy issues, there is nobody on the inside that you can put the pressure on that could have any effect, or at least I haven't found them. For example, under the Obama administration, we would have people literally inside the White House. We would have people in the State Department, and not just people in Congress, who we could talk to, who we could put the pressure on. We could find out where they lived and do a protest outside their house. We could do all kinds of things like that. In the case of Trump, yeah, we've gone to the home of John Bolton and done protests out there. He could give nothing. We've tried to, we have been arrested in hearings interrupting Mike Pompeo or Mark Esper, Secretary of Defense. They don't care. It doesn't. There's no line from there to the kind of effective pressure that you need. With Biden, already we're part of groups that have been mobilizing to put the pressure on Biden. And that could be through doing demonstrations at the Democratic Party offices, and it could be through getting group letters signed that then go to his campaign. And lo and behold, his campaign then responds. And they have been reaching out to the different groups on the left to say, let's have regular conversations. So maybe they're just playing us, but in any case, we're getting to know people who might be the people in the administration, who then we could have better campaigns, more effective campaigns to put the pressure on them. So I see it as actually quite different when you can have a campaign putting pressure on somebody who is pressurable, who could possibly care about you and your constituency. And if you grow your constituency, that would actually have more pressure on them versus people who are in their bubble and don't give a damn what you do.
Right. And don't even have to pretend that they give a damn, right? I mean, that might be the other thing. You might say, even if you believe such and such a Democratic person is a racist, dog and doesn't care about poor people any more than the Republican, they at least have to maybe pretend like they do, right? Which I mean, which still can be material. Victor, you've said a couple things I wanted to ask you to deepen, which you've touched on. One is this idea of elections as playing defense, social movements is playing kind of offense. I'd love to hear you deepen that notion a little bit. And the other thought is, when you've said this idea that we need to think of the election as a chance to have a total popular repudiation of the Trump administration, quite apart from whatever anyone thinks of Biden or the Democrats. I'd like to ask you, what in particular you think needs to be repudiated? Which I guess is another way of saying, what has been new about this Trump administration or different that really needs to be singled out, that represents a particular threat on whatever level you understand that threat to be, and that it needs to be needs to be so firmly rejected?
Well, one of the things that characterized Trump especially is he had this obsession from the beginning with undoing anything that Obama had done. So undoing notably the treaty about Iran, but also undoing any kind of restrictions on exploitation of the environment and so on. So it was a single-minded thing, you could say, also part of his racism, because given Obama's being black. And so that in itself was for Trump a kind of motivation for attacking him at every level, which he started to do even before he was nominated, with the business about challenging Obama's citizenship. So the racism is so deep and has had such a powerful impact in mobilizing hateful actions on the part of the white nationalist constituency, that's definitely something that I think it's extremely important to repudiate. So I think that would be the main point. What was the other point that you raised?
Well, I mean, it was about the question of offense and defense, right?
Oh, offense and defense,
I mean,
yes.
Victor, one thing I always appreciate about your work in every realm, you're only talking about kind of one aspect today, and I know, Medea, you've written about so many of these issues too, beyond just elections per se. But you refuse often, Victor, a kind of either or view, instead of trying to work through a kind of more, as we say in the Marxist tradition, dialectical kind of relationship between the different aspects of something, rather than just choosing one or the other. And so, I mean, I heard you the other day use this idea of elections as a primarily defensive maneuver in relationship to social movements as a more offensive strategy. I wonder if you could develop that a little bit for those who are listening.
Right. I'm not talking there about all elections, but I am talking about the U.S. presidential election. I mean, there are elections, including within the U.S., like the elections that have resulted in the victories of the Squad and recently of Jamal Bowman, that they were proactive. I in a way prefer the term proactive to offensive, but they were proactive. But when you have someone with as bad a record as Biden, then you have to look at the election as a defensive thing, because we have to be able to recognize the need to get Trump out, which means in an immediate sense casting a vote for Biden, without in any sense implying that we support what Biden has stood for or what he continues to stand for. So in that sense, the decision to say that in swing states the vote should go to Biden, it's a defensive thing. It's again, to repeat what Seren said, is choosing your enemies. It's defensive in the sense of helping to shape in whatever limited way the conditions in which we carry on our struggle that has a proactive or offensive aim.
Yeah, thanks for that clarification, Victor. And just for those who aren't familiar, the Seren that has been alluded to a couple times is actually Seren Mudliar, who is one of the co-producers of the show Shelter and Solidarity, as well as a well-known Boston area activist and a writer and author and fellow activist as well. And yes, I think his idea of choosing our enemies, right, making distinctions between the enemy we want to fight now and the enemy we'd rather fight later, right? Rather than thinking this idea that you have to be, to vote for someone, you have to ultimately be supporting them. Well, I want to, at this point, just make an announcement to everyone who's online right now with us on Zoom and on Facebook. Where in a few minutes, we will turn to some of your questions and comments. And so if you would like to indicate that you want to speak by putting a note in the chat box, or if you're on Facebook, writing in the Facebook thread, we'll try to get some of you. It's a little harder to get our Facebook watchers involved, but we can read your question, or we can unmute you and you can speak aloud if you're on the Zoom with us here. And so just in just a few minutes, we will turn in that direction. I know there's been quite a bit of buzz in the chat box here, so hopefully we'll have some good questions. I see Bobby Lee and some others are on the list. Actually, we have one right now from Hananya Pierre-Louis from Facebook, which I'd like to give voice to. Hananya asks of our guests, how do you foresee Trump's sowing of doubt into the electoral process, calling it rigged, affecting local elections, right? In what ways could what he's already saying affect the voting process that unfolds? And he adds to this, should we, I suppose those who are not for Trump, we seize upon this moment to define in what way the system is rigged and not leave it up to the conservatives to tap into that distrust that people have to serve their own agendas. So, I mean, I guess it's a kind of an interesting question here. It's like, how can we talk to people like they should have faith in the system in order to defend it, even as we also have, right, as Victor started the show with, quite a radical critique of the ways in which American democracy is not fully democratic to begin with. Like, how do we avoid falling into the kind of cynicism of dismissing what we have, right, even without romanticizing it in the way that maybe some liberals would like to. So I don't know, kind of two questions here. How do you see Trump's attempts to kind of diminish the election playing out? And also, should we ourselves embrace the critical approach to our electoral system rather than kind of just falling into a more, I guess, liberal, patriotic rhetoric around elections?
Well, I would say one thing is that Trump is not only commenting on elections, they're deputizing operatives to intimidate people. A whole program of having so-called poll watchers who go self-appointed, not official things, who go, they're deputizing. I read this article from Rolling Stone, 50,000 at least poll watchers around the country to go, and especially to constituencies with people of color, and to challenge their right to vote. So there's a real effort in that sense. In terms of defending the electoral process, I think we have to recognize the basic structure that if you have a voting system, that the popular vote is a potential instrument of change. It's not necessarily a vote for the status quo, and especially as we see now with the society in crisis, with the environmental emergency and so on, and the terrible racism, that the response to this, the vote is one small vehicle, but cumulatively an important one. And so I think that defending the right to vote is like defending free speech. It's not that free speech is given to us on a silver platter any more than the right to vote. The right to vote had to be fought for, as we know from the civil rights struggles, and as we still know now, the effort to overcome these restrictions on the right to vote. The people who have their polling places cut in, they cut 95% of the polling places recently in Kentucky to struggle and overcome that is a popular struggle. So you might say that in defending people's right to vote, you're defending the opportunity, slim as it might be, to protest or rebel against the system that's being imposed on us. And so it's the system has been, in other words, forced to give a certain element of democracy, but it does so begrudgingly And so we have to defend that, let's say, sliver of democracy against those who would try to shut it out, which is exactly what Trump and his cohorts are doing.
Okay, thank you. Victor, would
And,
you speak to this too?
yeah, I mean, it's a fabulous question, a really, really important one right now. And it kind of sends off some bells in my head that yes, actually, the implications of that question is right, that we should respond not by trying to defend the system and say it's not rigged, but by trying to educate people about how the system really is rigged. And certainly many of us would agree the system in the Democratic Party is rigged towards the more mainstream candidates. But looking at the issues right now, particularly in terms of presidential politics, we see it being rigged by the Republican Party. And and point out all of the structural problems that, Victor, you talk about in your book. So yes, it's a good opening for us to agree with Trump that the system is rigged, but it's not because of mail-in voting, voting by mail. It's because of all these other things. And then I think there was some mention about local elections in that question too. And I think that's a really important issue for us to talk about more, because we tend to put so much emphasis in the presidential elections and then the congressional elections. And I find not enough of us put our energies where we really can make the difference, and that is in local elections. And I ran as a Green Party candidate back in 2000. And our goal then, like I ran in California, I knew I was never going to win. I was running for Senate, but was to set up as many Green Party locals as we could in the state and support as many local elections as possible using that campaign. I don't really see that happening very much now. And I think that when we talk about Black Lives Matter and defund the police and the moment that we're in right now of such potential for wresting millions and millions of dollars in local funds and putting it into things that really benefit the people, local elections have even more importance now than before. So I would say that I love that question, and I think we can use it and as we debunk how undemocratic our system is, but not get people too cynical, because we want them to vote, and especially we want them to be active at the local level.
Yeah, these are great responses. Medea, I'd actually like to ask you to follow up. Could you elaborate a little bit or give us your brief assessment of what that Green Party campaign was like and how it played out? I mean, I really like the idea of conceiving of a local run that is primarily about setting up chapters, right, of a third party, of a more progressive alternative to what we have. How did you find that the electoral campaign form was conducive to that kind of organizing? I know some would say that it's again better to start with issues on the ground alone, because the electoral thing becomes such a distraction, and accusations of being a spoiler or all these kinds of, kind of mainstream corporate dominated narratives you can get drawn into. Did you feel that the local electoral effort, even though it was for a congressional office, was it not, was a viable strategic outlet? Would you recommend that, or would you feel, or do you have lessons from that you would like to share?
Well, in that case, it was in the state of California, which is heavily Democratic, and the Democratic Party was going to win. It was Dianne Feinstein's seat. There was no question of whether the Republican was going to win. And so it was a, quote, safe state for the Democrats, and we didn't get that kind of pushback about being spoilers. And yes, it was the perfect venue, because it was the ability to travel all around the state, to get local groups to organize, to bring different issues together. It was certainly intersectional, and a perfect venue for doing that. But if you were doing it in a swing state, I think you'd get a lot more pushback from it, and it wouldn't be the same kind of ability to really go into a community, bring people together, have that kind of positive energy. So I think it depends on when and where.
Okay, great. I'd love to hear more about that. But we now have so many questions. I'm afraid I'm going to lose somebody if I don't start making some space. So here's what I'd like to do. Guests, let me know if you want to jump in and just take the first question as such. What I usually like to do is maybe take a couple question/comments so that we can get more voices out there, and then we'll go back. So I have Bobby Lee, I have Ben, and I have Joe Nevins, who is also on it, although yeah. So let's go, Bobby Lee.
Yeah, so I'm going to preface this a little bit before I get into the question. So I was watching the news a couple weeks ago now, and across the bottom of the news, right, it said America in crisis. And then it was like, without a leader. And immediately my first thought was, we've been in crisis. We're not now in crisis. This isn't a new thing, right? We have been in crisis for decades. But did it take us not having a leader for us to actually get these movements, for us to get people to pay attention, to get people in the streets, right? How many people had been killed during the, Black men specifically, had been killed during the Obama administration, and we never saw the reaction that we saw to George Floyd, right? But I think that had we had an Obama or even a Bush, they would have, been able to tamp us down. They would have been giving us a nice speech about how it's wrong, and that could have been them or someone they know, and how it was really upsetting. And we all would have been placated with that pretty speech, right? And then you see like the economic collapse and just everything that's going on. I'm just wondering if it actually took us to have no leader or an incompetent leader for us to really break through and get to where we are, or if this would have happened without that. And then also, I mean, look, I cannot take Trump. I don't want to live in a fascism. I mean, we are living in fascism. I don't want it to get worse, right? Like I can't take that. But if we get Biden, is he going to be able to tamp that down? Is he going to be able to kind of give us the pretty speeches and get us back under wraps and calm everyone down and get people out of the streets? Because I really think the only reason people are still there is because of who's in office. So I'm just curious what people are thinking about that. If I'm totally off the mark,
That's a very rich question. Let's actually go to our guests for that. I mean, I'm reminded as Bobby Lee was speaking of, I think Glenn Ford was one for the Black Agenda Report who described Obama as not the lesser evil, but the more effective evil, right? And so there's argument that in fact Trump's ineptitude and utter corruption can in fact enable a kind of spurring of mass protest that might not be possible under a more apparently rational, at least on some level, together Democrat. What do you think about this? Is this is this something to consider, Medea, Victor?
Well, just one quick comment is that I think the severity of the economic and the environmental situation has been aggravated, and even more, so that it would be a challenge to anyone. And I think in terms of the George Floyd thing coming in the midst of the pandemic, but also the fact that the spectacular nature of the way it was shown had a galvanizing effect. It's not just, in other words, the incompetence of Trump, but it's the convergence of all these crises and the ultra graphic nature of the murder of George Floyd, I think, contribute to this.
Well, I would add the pandemic, because I think if we don't get Trump out of office, there's going to be hundreds of thousands of more people dying. Whereas if we had a Biden administration, there might be more amenable to a strategy that could tamp down this pandemic and not make people and move us in a direction that other countries have gone in terms of being able to flatten the curve and then move in the direction of a vaccine that could be available to a lot more people than I think would be available if it were under Trump. So I think the pandemic adds another element of urgency to this. I understand what you're saying, Bobby Lee, and I certainly saw that when we had a very vibrant anti-war movement that just fell apart when Obama came in, because people thought he was going to be the peace president. But I do think that what Victor said, when certain things happen that are so outrageous, you can get movements going on even under a Democratic president. And I think that would happen under Biden because he's not the first Black president. He's not the first woman president. He's an elderly white guy that people don't really like. So coming out against him is not going to be as difficult as it was to get people out against Obama.
Bobby Lee wanted to respond. Bobby Lee, who's sometimes a co-host here on Shelter in Solidarity as well. Bobby Lee?
Yeah, I guess I didn't formulate it as much as I wanted to when I first started saying it, but I think incompetency, not just in George Floyd, but in the pandemic, in the economy, in everything. Like, he's just been so incompetent at the way he's handled everything, which, like Victor said, kind of created this perfect storm, sort of speak, for us to be in this space. But did we have to get this broken, I guess, is my question, for people to be able to get in the streets? Did it have to get this bad? Did it take that? Because everyone else has been able to kind of manage, even though the economy is crap, even though our lives suck, even though, living wages for millennials and all of that stuff, like, did it take someone that incompetent for us to really wake up to this? And I guess and then on top of that, this perfect storm, I guess that's more of my question. And if we get someone competent who's able to kind of put things a little bit back together, is that going to just stop everything and stop all that forward movement that's kind of happening now? Maybe that's how I should have framed it. I apologize.
Very helpful either way. I mean, I think, Bobby Lee, you may be already overstating the competence of the person of Biden in any way. You know what I mean? I get Medea's point about Biden's limited ability to co-opt in the way that an Obama could, I think speaks at least partly to your point, though it's an open question. The only thing I would add to it is that, Trump is certainly not helping everyone to wake up to the reality of the world around us. In fact, you might argue a certain part of Americans are actually being put to sleep in a very, ideologically speaking, in a particular way. So it's certainly a big question. Maybe we could take a few more, unless Medea or Victor, you feel the urgent need to jump in on this, or can we hear a couple more and we can continue to address Bobby Lee's overall concern?
Well, I would just say that if you look at the environmental movement, and Victor has been talking about the crisis in the environment, you see a steady build up of organizing, no matter who was in the White House, no matter if it was confronting Nancy Pelosi in her office or it was confronting a Republican. And I think that's the kind of model we want to go for. You just keep building and building and building, and you put the pressure on whoever is in power.
Yeah, and I would also say that there's been this tremendous continuing increase in inequality. And so the economic situation has been getting more and more precarious all the time. So quite independently of, of the competence of anyone in the top position, this crisis has been brewing. And again, I refer to Richard Wolff's analyses for this. I think it's very convincing.
Yeah, okay. I'd like us to take, this time for real, 2 comments. We have Bruce Simon and Ben Stork. Let's hear those, and then after that, we'll bring in Joe, but maybe after we go back to the panel. Bruce?
Hey, everybody. So I kind of want to play devil's advocate here a little and articulate a position that I don't necessarily believe in, but one that I think might be relevant to the conversation, which is kind of a revolutionary position. Do we need Trump to break things so badly that the U.S. state isn't functioning, that the federal government isn't functioning, that it creates the conditions for revolution in the next 4 years? I personally live in a very red district with a lot of people who own guns who would not be very revolutionary in the way I would want them to be. So that's why I call it devil's advocacy. But, we're assuming democracy is the bulwark here, is the good. But, as you know, some revolutionary Marxists don't even really think democracy is the answer.
I had a sense that Bobby Lee's question would be staying with us, and it certainly is. Thank you, Bruce. Ben, let's hear from you.
All right, thank you, guys. Tempted to pick up on Bruce's question a little bit, but I will resist and actually ask you all to comment on municipalism Actually, we've talked a little bit about local elections, but most of those have been on state level campaigns. I'm thinking about what's going on, for instance, in Jackson, Mississippi, with Action Jackson and Patrice Lumumba, but also I'm in Seattle, where we have an open socialist city council person who led the fight for a $15 minimum wage here, as well as now 7 of 9 city council members who, in response to on-the-ground protests, have committed to defunding the police by 50%, and are literally in the process of attempting to do that, though it's full of potholes, right? But I guess like when we think about what we mean by democracy, there is a way that the national as well as the state level absorbs almost all the energy, and we miss some of the things that are going on the ground in more local contexts, and the power of cities in particular. And I know that can be problematic when we think about the relationship between the urban and the rural, but we also have to recognize that cities do play an outsized role, certainly economically, and therefore are leverage points. So I guess I wonder what y'all think about municipalism as a movement.
And just to tag on to Ben's, I mean, of course, as we're seeing in places like Portland and Chicago, a very acute battle between federal government policies or directives and city government, and literally mayors in the streets being tear gassed in Portland and other. So, I mean, certainly I think Ben flagged something very important about the local and the city in particular. Great, lots in those 2 questions to pick up. Medea?
Well, I'm a great fan of the municipal strategy. I think that's where we're going to get the results, whether it's getting this money out of the police and putting it into other real needs, whether it's significant environmental changes that could be models for other cities, whether it's participatory budget kind of things, reparations that the city of Asheville just voted on. I mean, that's where we get some excitement, some real change that I think then inspires people in other cities to do something similar or even better. And then on the other hand, I want to take the other question by Bruce and really put it on an international level, because the US is an imperialist country, and what we do affects so much the rest of the world. So if you have this notion that maybe we need a Trump because that's going to get the revolutionary forces out in this country, think of what it's going to do to the international community in those same times. The Trump administration pulled out of the WHO, which is devastating. The Trump administration is pulling out of nuclear treaties and want to do nuclear testing again, and leading to a nuclear arms race, which, you know, I talked about the pulling out of the deal with Iran, which is totally leading us onto a path of another war in the Middle East. So I think we have to have in mind the destruction that can be caused on the international level when you have somebody like Trump that is so disdainful of the rest of the world, and again, not reachable through any kind of movements that we can build up.
Yeah, I agree entirely with Medea. I would just add one thing, that in a sense, you could say that the government in this country is already not functioning in the form of its incapacity to deal with the pandemic. It has shown its total failure. And I think this does provide an entry, perhaps similar to the kind that you were thinking of, Bruce.
And then to add on to that, Victor, we've seen in other countries where things are really falling apart. Many of the times that is not the most revolutionary time, because people are so consumed with getting enough food, with finding a shelter, with taking care of the day-to-day needs. It's oftentimes when things are a little better and it's more of the middle class that rises up during times that can be described like the Arab Spring or other examples like that.
Very interesting, very interesting. We have at least 2 more questions from Joe Nevins, and then next we will bring in Tim Sheard, another co-producer of the show. Joe, you there? Make sure to unmute yourself, Joe, if we can, so we can hear you at least. Joe, are you there? I have your question written out. I can just read it if you're having trouble. Last call. Okay, Joe's having some technical problems, but he had a very interesting question. I'm scrolling up to find it. And it was for you, Victor. Thank you, he says, to both of you, Medea and Victor, for your great work over many years and for sharing your analysis with us this evening. Assuming that Biden wins, actually, I think this is for both of you. Sorry, I just misread it. Assuming that Biden wins, what do you see as important opportunities or spaces for the left and progressives to engage beyond voting rights legislatively to alter the structural limitations of the US electoral system? Are there particular proposals or initiatives on this front that you see as winnable in the coming years were sufficient mobilization to take place? So I think that's a question about what could be achieved in terms of the electoral system, but perhaps on other issues too. I mean, Victor, you haven't had much of a chance to talk about your work on the environmental crisis and the need for eco-socialism. So I'd be interested, since Joe can't speak to it, in hearing your thoughts on what could be changed about the electoral system, perhaps the electoral college, et cetera, but also on other particular issues. I know, Medea, you've touched on this in terms of foreign policy a bit, but I'd like to hear more. If Biden wins, what could progressives conceivably push through that we otherwise could not?
Well, just to start, in terms of the electoral system, the most promising avenue towards abolishing the electoral college, formally it would require a constitutional amendment, and that's obviously terribly difficult, cumbersome, almost impossible. However, the system of getting state legislatures to commit themselves that all their electoral votes would go to whichever candidate wins the national popular vote. That as of the latest count, had been approved by states accounting for 195 electoral votes, and they need to get to a threshold of, I think, 271 or something. That's something that doesn't depend on Biden, that depends on state legislatures. However, if there is a big shift of direction, and obviously, again, this is something that is likely to be supported by Democrats and not by Republicans, but if that could be put in as a step towards changing the, just bypassing the electoral college, that would be of potential interest. But also, I think more broadly, in terms of the election, a national electoral law with a guarantee, constitutional, well, not constitutional, but just a legal guarantee, everyone has the right to vote. A positive, affirmative, proactive statement of the right to vote, which, as I said, doesn't exist yet. That would be a major thing. As for the environment, yes, I mean, obviously this is a tremendous area of substantive concern. There has to be a terrific mobilization around this, but I think the demand has to be for something like the bringing all the energy producers into the public sector. I mean, that the corporations that dominate the fossil fuels are going to continue exploiting it as long as it's profitable for them to do it. They have to be taken out. And of course, this is a huge project that goes far beyond what Biden himself would advocate. But it's definitely, in terms of a proactive step that should be proposed, is one that I would put at the top of the list, along with a larger, Green New Deal in a larger sense, but with really with teeth, not just giving incentives to private companies, but actually providing public works that would carry out the kind of green transformation that's necessary at every level of the society.
Thank you, Victor. Medea, what do you see as the areas that under Biden it might be conceivable to push change that is not otherwise?
Yeah, it's been interesting to see the areas where there have been working groups where the Biden team has brought in people from the Sanders team. And some of the things that they've come up with have been quite progressive, particularly, for example, around the environmental issues, way better than Biden's platform has been in the past. A big fight has been around the Medicare for All issue, and a lot of people are very angry with how bad the Democratic platform is, the refusal to understand that during a pandemic, people as eyes are opened up to say, hey, we need a healthcare system, a real system, one that covers everybody. So I think as things get worse health-wise here, and when you think of how a vaccine is going to be dealt with, there's going to be a lot more momentum for pushing for a Medicare for all system. And then I think also around people, the people's needs that have been highlighted so much with this pandemic, like the lack of paid parental leave, things like that. There's going to be more momentum for. And then I would say on the international realm, I already talked about the sanctions. I think that the Biden administration could be convinced to soften it because of the pandemic. The pandemic might be their excuse to say, all right, we're really tough guys, but we're going to make allowances because of this pandemic and lift a lot of the restrictions on things like food and medicines. I think we could see that happening. There'll be a big fight about the Pentagon budget. Other members of the Democratic Party who were running for president had said that, yes, we should cut the Pentagon budget. Joe Biden was never one of those. There's a big campaign right now that Bernie Sanders was leading, cut the Pentagon budget by 10%. We lost that, but I think there's momentum for that. So those kinds of things.
Very interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think you both remind us that many of the decisions that affect our lives under this capitalist system, with this military-industrial complex and its privately owned energy companies, do not fall, within what we generally think of as the realm of public legislation. Though potentially they could, in theory, right? The democracy could be grown so they could actually rein in and control and even transfer to the public some of what we currently understand as privately held means of production. We have Tim has a question, and also Ben. I neglected to give Ben his follow-up chance with his earlier question. And Ben, I know you always have something very sharp to say, so I would like to include you. So let's take Tim's question and Ben's reply, and then we'll put out maybe a last call for questions from our live viewers as we bring this puppy home. Tim?
Thank you, Joe. Hi, Victor and Medea. One of my concerns is how we can convince masses of people to change their attitude toward the environment, because we're so wed on a consumer culture and frankly a culture of individualism and not caring about the social sphere. And so how do we get people to demand that the power generating companies, for example, switch to 100% renewable, demand it, and that people give up their cars as an example, as their gas and diesel? How do we get away from that as long as we have capitalism having such an effect on our culture and on our ideas about individualism?
Great, profound question, Tim. Ben, if you could add your reply to that, and then we'll bring it back to Medea and Victor. You're muted, Ben.
There we go. Sure. So I should say my follow-up is more through Bruce's question. I cannot resist an anti-electoralism argument. I'm not, and I'll be doing this not as a devil's advocate, though also not as an accelerationist. So I think basically, and I think this actually picks up on some of what Tim is asking too, do you see electoralism fundamentally as a harm reduction strategy? Because I'll be honest, from my perspective, it has little to no effect towards any sort of meaningful change. At best, you are reducing harm, at best. And therefore, the question becomes whether there is a trade-off in harm reduction that represses sort of revolutionary potential, right? And I think that that's a real problem, because if you could take Bobby Lee's suggestion about Trump's incompetence pushing us to an edge, right? And actually flip it and say, actually, Trump's incompetence makes it easier for us to accept a figure like Biden. In fact, it was Biden's entire electoral strategy was to say, I'm not Trump, right? So much to the effect of saying, voting for the policies that you like, that Bernie Sanders actually represents, is not viable because of the risk of continuing Trump. So we'll continuously have this back and forth in which a supposedly competent liberal can say, well, we will reduce harm, therefore keep us around. So I guess I kind of want to push that more revolutionary line and think, yes, we can still vote for harm reduction, but we also need to sort of push outside of the electoral system in really strong ways and not get sucked into it, and treat it as what it is, which is harm reduction.
Really interesting. I'm glad we got you back in, Ben. Medea and Victor, a lot there from Tim on individualism and the cultural capitalism that's inside people that needs to be transcended, and Ben on this crucial question. Medea first, and then Victor.
I'm very concerned about the consumerism, and in some ways, for some people, it's heightened by this pandemic when you see how Amazon has just grown so tremendously because of this, and it was already a monster and is even a greater one now. On the other hand, I think there are these possibilities that people see different ways of living. It's a question whether the young people are going to want to continue to flock to cities, and certainly suburbs are not exciting for them. So coming up with something very different. I live in, when I'm in Florida, in a community of urban farmers, and people live collectively, and a lot of them are off the grid, and they're getting more and more people flocking to them. So there's more movements like that. I'm not saying that's going to be possible for a vast majority of people, but you do have to have some of those experiments that give people alternatives. And in terms of harm reduction, I would agree on the national level, yes, but we've talked about the differences that can happen in local elections. And there I see in the city councils where you get the moves for a living wage, where you get the kind of changes in people's lives that make a real difference. So I would say let's make sure we just distinguish between voting for Biden as a harm reduction strategy, but getting involved in local politics to make some real change.
Great. Victor?
Yeah, in terms of the environment, I think this is a huge educational task, but one of the things is just to emphasize in all possible ways the level of the emergency. And I think here, again, the role of the alternative media is extremely important, and it needs to be amplified also by demonstrations. Certainly we have all the, let's say, actual experience necessary to persuade people of this, from the burning forest fires to the terrible floods from hurricanes, and there are disasters and droughts and things all over the place. And I think that this, in a way, is it just needs to be transmitted, and people have to be made aware of this. And then on the more positive side, bring people over by partly by the kind of example that Medea mentions, but I think also by public policies that will make it less necessary for people to depend on cars, for transforming the cities in certain ways. There's a recent book called Free Public Transit, which has experiences of different cities around the world. And the possibility that, if you actually have a free public transit system in place, it can draw people away. There can be a combination of positive inducements with sort of disincentives to continue with the private automobile, like limiting access or charging a lot. So one has to depend on a combination of instruction and inducements and incentives and penalties. It's a complicated thing, but the main thing is to have a tremendous emphasis on the importance of the environmental thing. As for electoral harm reduction, yes, I mean, that's essentially another way of saying what I had in mind when I speak of the defensive aspect of elections. But I would say that that's not the only aspect, and it depends on the particular election. Certainly, voting for Biden would be in the harm reduction category. But what I was saying is that the harm reduction is not something to which we should devote a great deal of energy. The way I look at it is that in a way we're taking stock of where we are, what the actual options are available, just at the moment that we go into the voting booth and say, well, we've accomplished this much, but we haven't accomplished enough to really change the configuration of the alternatives. So given the limitations, we have to vote for the so-called lesser evil. But it's not a strategic goal. It's something that we do just briefly at the moment of voting in the course of a longer term project, which does not accept harm reduction as a sufficient objective.
Really interesting. And I mean, I really appreciate having so many voices here who are able to make that distinction, right? That we can be pragmatic and strategic, harm reduction, defensive strategy on elections where we haven't really, the pick is not what we would choose, while also dreaming big and being honest about the real fundamental changes that we need to make and being strategic about that as well. We're going to try to squeeze in two more brief questions, and then we will go back to our two guests and also just ask them to conclude with any overall points they'd like to leave us with, any particular campaigns or links or organizations that they'd like to help us connect to. We try to leave people with something they can literally do at the end of this show on whatever level that may be. So we're going to call on Mark Soderstrom, who's actually one of our guests from our last week's show, who's back for more. Glutton for punishment. Mark.
Thank you, Joe. I'm still sort of trying to formulate this in my head, but there is sort of a disturbing way in which we consistently begin to refer to the parties as if there's something outside ourselves and separate from our participation, and perhaps we can feel that way at the national level. I don't feel very participatory with Biden, but in reality, it seems like there's more like 435 Democratic parties. You know, every House of Representatives is its own Democratic Party organization. And if you want an environmental active vote, find out who your water district supervisor is, right? I mean, they make major decisions about water quality and health and drainage and pollution. But there does seem to me that there's got to be some other strategies besides be a Democrat or run as a Green. And there have been other alternative approaches even to electoral politics, such as the Nonpartisan League, that worked as advocacy outside the party structure, but then weighted the election by manipulating the primaries particularly. And those are things that it seems to me would work at the local and perhaps even the state level, and get us away from this be a Democrat, sell out, or be a Green and be a spoiler. I hope that makes sense. There's a question in there somewhere. I'm sorry.
Okay, so a call to think more creatively and looking at specific opportunities to work the system without falling into its traps here. On a different note, I think James Wilberforce has a question as well. James, could you unmute yourself?
Yes, sir. Hi, Medea.
Hey, James.
Hi, Comrade Wallis.
Hi, James.
Have you read all those books?
I've at least looked at them. I've read some of them.
You probably wrote a few of them too.
Yeah.
Well, this is great conversation. Although, you know, I have to say, I don't want to spend a lot of time debating and talking about whether to vote for Biden or not. I mean, I think there are going to be a lot of people who are going to spend the next 3 or 4 months around and around on that. And I know that's not what you're doing, and I'm glad for that. I do want to, as an aside, I'm an elected member of the Democratic City Committee of Cambridge. It's even easier than getting out of bed in the morning. You just walk to the polling place on election day, ask a few people to write you in, and you're on the Democratic City Committee. Now, what that means is maybe useful to think about, but not for right now, because what I really want to ask about is Israel and Palestine. Both of you, I know that you've both been interested in that, and I know especially Medea has done a lot of work on this. I just give us one example, an Arab American friend of mine from Morocco. He's not even from, you know, near Palestine, who is an American citizen who used to work at the Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Harvard. For him, and I think for many Arab Americans, and for an increasing number of Americans who may not be Arab American, the question of Israel and Palestine and Palestinian rights and human rights has become extremely important. And obviously Biden is terrible on that. And So how does how does that fit into our understanding of what we're grappling with in the context of what we've all been discussing tonight? And thanks, everybody.
Thanks, James. Maybe Medea, maybe to you first on this, and then to Victor, and then I'll ask you each for a closing statement, I guess. Yeah.
Sure. On the on what Mark you were bringing up, I feel very eclectic, and I often get in trouble with folks on various sides of issues. But I'm on the advisory board of Progressive Democrats of America. I support Greens. I'm an independent. I can vote on one way, local, and one way national. So I really feel like I don't want to be pigeonholed into a party, but I also feel that we can go in and out of these structures as they fit our needs. The other is around Israel, Palestine, and Biden. Biden is certainly terrible, but he's no worse than Trump is. I mean, Trump has just been unbelievable, moving the embassy to Jerusalem, giving the green light for expansion of settlements, giving the green light for annexation, for God's sake. But Biden said he's a great friend of Israel. If it hadn't been created, we would have had to create it. There's no, but the positive thing is that the Democratic Party itself has been changing, and the base and the young people in the Democratic Party have been changing, and that's reflected in the polls. So Joe Biden is not a surprise to you all here that he's out of touch with his own base. And sooner or later, that's going to have to catch up with him. If you look at the largest foreign policy lobby group in the United States, AIPAC, it used to be really a bipartisan group. It's become more and more a Republican lobby group. And we saw with the presidential candidates for the Democratic nomination, most of them stayed clear of AIPAC, which was quite remarkable. So sooner or later, a Biden administration would have to start dealing with this issue of should we condition aid to Israel? Because that's a key question that keeps coming up, and more people are supporting that position. And I think we would have a chance under a Biden administration. And I know because I've been in these conversations where you have the very progressive Jewish groups and others who are having these discussions with the Biden people, not successfully yet, but at least the discussion is there. And so I would say we'd have more of a chance with Biden than we would with Trump for doing things like conditioning the aid. I'm sure all of us would love to see every single dollar of the $3.8 billion that we give to the Israeli military cut off yesterday. That ain't going to happen. So we could get some slight improvements under Biden.
Thank you, Medea. And you are, of course, proof that you can be talking about electoral strategy and direct action on this issue, even in a very high stakes way at the same time. Again, resisting the kind of either or, which I feel like too often at the left, at least in the social media verse I inhabit, get sucked into very unproductive either ors when we really need a more creative both and.
Oh,
Victor,
I forgot to just say there is this movement for a new party, and I'm part of that.
Movement for a new party. All right, we can put that link in the chat box, perhaps in the moments we have left. Victor, I'd love to hear you address either or both of these questions, and then we will go back to both Medea and Victor for kind of a closing comment. Yeah.
Yeah, I think Medea's given an excellent description of the Israel-Palestine situation. I have nothing to add to that. As far as the Green Party is concerned, I would just re-emphasize what I said before. I hope that the Green Party gets a bigger audience. They have a tremendous job to overcome every election year, getting on the ballot in enough states, but they have a good message. Now they've moved towards an eco-socialist position, and I think that they should be part of the process of building towards an eventual independent political force. The Greens themselves are not enough to constitute that force, but there has to be something outside the Democrats that's present, and that even not only does good educational work in its own terms, but also forces any Democrat candidate to think not only of whether they might lose something to the Republicans, but also whether they might lose support from people who are part of their base. I mean, because the Greens appeal to the constituencies that are the base of the Democratic Party. And if they can make a stronger case, not only will it build their own organization, but it could also have an effect in making Democrat candidates more progressive.
Really interesting. Yeah, the idea that an alternative party formation could be a center of gravity, right? That pulls in and exerts pressure even within the Democratic Party. I'd like to just ask you both to maybe offer. You've offered so much, so I'm not going to ask you to give a big speech here. But are there some final words, a final phrase, a final nod, a plug, something you're doing you want to let people know about, or that words you just like to leave folks with on this Thursday evening?
Which one you want to go first?
Why don't you go first, since we just heard from Victor Medea?
Okay. I want to leave with a campaign I'm working on that has been so much fun and so uplifting. And that is a campaign to award the Nobel Peace Prize to the Cuban doctors. And you can find it on cubannobel.org. It's a fantastic campaign because it educates people and inspires people about what you could do, what a small country with such limited resources is able to do now, sending doctors to 37 countries to fight coronavirus. And then it also shows you how evil the evil empire is, because the United States is trying to sabotage that program, calls these doctors modern day slaves, calls the program human trafficking. And there's a bill in Congress now to sanction countries that accept the help from these Cuban doctors. So go to cubannobel.org, please sign a petition and help us to spread the word.
Oh, Medea, that is great to learn about. Thank you so much for sharing that. And we have the link in the chat box. We'll share it on our Facebook page. And maybe we'll ask you or someone from that campaign to join us in a few weeks. We're planning to get to a show on international comparisons in terms of the response to COVID. And we would really love to have the Cuban response nationally and internationally involved in that conversation. Thank you so much. Victor?
Well, first of all, I want to say I thoroughly support Medea's plea for support to the Cubans. That's a great program, and I think it really deserves a lot of support. In terms of things, one big project that's not widely known but very important is the newspaper called the San Francisco Bayview, which is its subtitle is a national black newspaper, but its special constituency really is prisoners and people who support prisoners. But it deals with a wide range of issues. It comes out both on the web and in print, very importantly, in order to be accessible to prisoners. And so they're trying to bring about an editorial transition. They've been run on a volunteer basis up to now, but they need to consolidate themselves. So that's a big campaign that they've launched and that needs support. So SF Bayview, I think, is the website, sfbayview.com. And then apart from that, I want to thank Joe, especially not only for organizing this, but for promoting my books. And I'd like to plug my books and just mention that anyone who would like to have me address a group about any of the subjects of my 3 books, and you can find out about them at my website, victorwallis.com, I'd be glad to do that. So thanks again.
Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Medea. I want to point out, I reviewed Victor's book in a little essay called 2 Books. This is before his 3rd one came out. 2 books for a World on Fire, or Deep Reflections for a World on Fire. And who published that? San Francisco Bayview, right? A newspaper actually read by many prisoners. And I was just doing a little Googling as you were talking, Victor. I don't quite have the precise answer to this question, but if prisoners could vote and you consider them a state, they'd be, they certainly wouldn't be the smallest state in the union. They'd be more populated than Maine, right? I mean, again, I think it's worth maybe finishing a conversation about voting rights and the importance of struggling for what's left of our electoral democracy. It's maybe appropriate to remember that there are, again, as we started this conversation with, many people left outside of those voting rights right now, incarcerated, formerly incarcerated, undocumented workers, no matter how long they've been here, people who live in parts of the greater United States, as it's recently been termed, in the empire, whose destinies are affected by the US government in so many ways, who have no vote in the presidential election, as well as the many, literally over 100 countries where the United States has bases or has waged wars in recent times, who are directly affected by the decisions this government makes. I wonder what the results of the election would be if all those people could vote.
Right on.
Welcome here. I mean, so just thank you all for being here, especially to Victor and Medea and everyone who offered such thoughtful comments, and everyone who's been watching and has been supporting this project, which is a testament to the need to build alternative media, alternative networks, firmly committed to a transformative vision, while also engaging with what's being done on all fronts we can touch. I want to invite you to next week's, our 18th show, next week, Shelter in Solidarity, this weekly project. We're going to take the week off because it's the day after my birthday, but we decided not to, in part because we got two terrific speakers who will be joining us. We have the 2020 Pulitzer Prize winning author, Greg Grandin, author of The End of the Myth, From the Frontier to the Border Wall in the Mind of America, a book I could not recommend more highly. Greg Grandin will be joining us, with Avi Chomsky, also author of many or several very important books, including Undocumented and They Take Our Jobs, and 20 other myths about immigration. That will be next week, Thursday, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard. As usual, we hope you will join us, invite your friends, join the conversation, and get involved with helping to build this project. We really can only reach the audience that we build. We don't have the magic of money and corporate influence to build Shelter and Solidarity. Shelter in Solidarity, however, does have the support of its sponsors, Hardball Press, which publishes particularly working class stories, laborpress.org, which publishes working class journalism, Socialism and Democracy, the journal that Victor Wallis himself has been stewarding for so long and that several of us work on as well, Socialism and Democracy, that's sdonline.org. And last but not least, Encuentro Cinco, a long-standing, decades-old hub of organizing, progressive and radical organizing in the heart of downtown Boston. I want to thank my producers, Linda Liu, Suren Mudliar, Tim Sheard, Kira Mudliar, and all the others who have helped to put this show on. We welcome you to hang around after the show if you'd like to debrief. We're democratic like that. We love to hear your feedback. Otherwise, see you next week.